Nobody ever tells you that the road back home can remember your name long before you remember who you used to be. The tires hummed softly against the faded highway as the red earth stretched endlessly beyond my windshield. It had been almost 9 years since I last drove this road, yet every curve, every weathered fence post, and every lonely oak tree seemed exactly where I had left them. Time had touched everything, but somehow the land refused to forget. People call this part of Oklahoma red dirt. To most travelers, it was just another patch of quiet countryside surrounded by cattle ranches and open skies. To me, it was the place where my entire life quietly changed direction without asking my permission. I slowed the truck as the familiar dirt road appeared ahead. A wooden sign leaned slightly to one side, its white paint faded by countless summers. Hayes Ranch. Seeing those 2 words sent an ache through my chest that years of traveling had never managed to erase. I rested both hands on the steering wheel. "I guess I'm finally back," I whispered to no one. The engine continued idling while I stared through the windshield. I had photographed glaciers in Alaska, deserts in Arizona, wolves in Montana, and hurricanes forming over the Gulf Coast. My camera had carried me across nearly every corner of America. Magazines printed my work. Galleries displayed my photographs. People often told me how lucky I was to spend my life chasing beautiful places. They never realized that the most important place I had ever known wasn't breathtaking because of the landscape. It was because of one man. His name was Griffith Hayes. Long before anyone recognized my photographs, before I understood what love actually looked like, before success became something strangers measured with awards and headlines, there had only been a dusty ranch road and a quiet young rancher who smiled with his eyes far more often than with his mouth. If someone had stopped me that first morning and told me I was about to meet the person who would shape the rest of my life, I probably would have laughed. Life rarely announces its biggest moments. They arrive disguised as ordinary days. Mine began with a flat tire. I was 23 years old, driving across western Oklahoma on assignment for a small outdoor magazine that barely paid enough to cover gas. My editor wanted photographs of abandoned prairie towns before they disappeared completely. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. The August sun had turned the highway into shimmering waves of heat when the front tire exploded without warning. The truck lurched violently before rolling onto the gravel shoulder. "Perfect," I muttered. There wasn't another vehicle in sight. No cell service. Nothing except endless fields stretching toward the horizon. After wrestling the damaged tire from the truck, I discovered the spare had almost no air left. I leaned against the tailgate, laughing at the absurdity of my own bad luck. That was when I heard it. The distant rumble of an old pickup. It appeared slowly through a cloud of red dust before stopping several yards away. The driver's door opened. A tall man climbed out wearing faded blue jeans, worn work boots, and a sun-bleached denim shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. His blonde hair caught the afternoon light, while his calm blue eyes studied the situation before drifting toward me. "You look like you could use a hand." His voice carried the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent his entire life beneath open skies. "I won't argue with that," I admitted. He smiled, not broadly, just enough to soften the seriousness of his face. "My name's Griffith." "Nathan." He extended a rough, calloused hand, the kind built from years of honest work. I shook it without realizing that one simple gesture would quietly divide my life into 2 chapters. Everything before I met Griffith, and everything that came after. Some people walk into your life with grand speeches and unforgettable entrances. Griffith Hayes arrived carrying an air tank and a wrench. "I've got an air compressor back at the ranch," he said, glancing at my nearly flat spare tire. "You're welcome to use it if you don't mind driving a few miles off the highway." I looked around at the endless stretch of empty road before laughing softly. "I don't think I'm in a position to be picky." The corner of his mouth lifted into a quiet smile. "Follow me." 20 minutes later, my truck rolled through the weathered wooden gate of Hayes Ranch. The place wasn't impressive in the way luxury estates impress people. There were no iron gates or perfectly trimmed hedges. Instead, there were rolling pastures, sturdy fences repaired countless times, horses grazing beneath cottonwood trees, and a red barn whose faded paint told stories older than either of us. Everything felt honest. Everything had earned its place. Griffith parked beside a workshop before grabbing the air hose. "You can pull in over here." While he worked, I wandered a few steps away, instinctively lifting my camera from the passenger seat. The afternoon sunlight spilled across the fields, turning the tall grass into waves of gold. Dust floated lazily through the warm air. In the distance, a lone horse trotted toward a watering trough, while several calves followed their mothers across the pasture. Without thinking, I pressed the shutter. Click. Another frame. Then another. You see things differently. Griffith's voice came from behind me. I lowered the camera. What do you mean? He nodded toward the landscape. I've lived here my whole life. And I stopped noticing how beautiful it is. His words lingered longer than either of us expected. I smiled. That's the funny thing about photography. What? It usually isn't about finding beautiful places. He looked at me curiously. It's about reminding people they've been standing in one all along. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sounds came from distant cattle, rustling grass, and the steady rhythm of compressed air filling my spare tire. You hungry? Griffith asked suddenly. I glanced at my watch. I skipped lunch. I figured. He shrugged with effortless simplicity. My grandmother made enough beef stew to feed half the county. I probably shouldn't impose. You'd be doing us a favor. Before I could politely refuse again, he was already walking toward the farmhouse. The house sat beneath two enormous oak trees, its wide front porch lined with rocking chairs that looked as though generations had watched sunsets from the exact same spot. The front door opened before we reached it. An older woman with silver hair smiled warmly. You finally brought someone home instead of another stray calf. Griffith sighed. Grandma. She ignored him completely. You must be the photographer. I blinked. How did you know? She pointed toward the camera hanging around my neck. That was my first clue. I laughed. I suppose that makes sense. I'm Eleanor Hayes. Nathan Brooks. She shook my hand before looking toward Griffith with unmistakable amusement. See? He smiles. I smile. Barely. Griffith rolled his eyes with the patience of someone who had lost this particular argument many years ago. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread, rosemary, and slow-cooked vegetables. It felt less like entering a stranger's home and more like stepping into a memory I hadn't lived yet. Lunch stretched into coffee. Coffee became stories. Eleanor shared tales about the ranch, while Griffith quietly repaired a broken cabinet hinge without being asked. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, every sentence seemed carefully considered, as though wasting words simply wasn't part of who he was. As the afternoon sun drifted lower, I realized something unusual. For the first time in months, I hadn't once thought about my next assignment, my deadlines, or the miles waiting beyond the horizon. Instead, I found myself watching Griffith laugh at one of his grandmother's jokes. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was small, genuine. And somehow, in that ordinary kitchen surrounded by red dirt and familiar silence, I had the quiet, unmistakable feeling that leaving this ranch might prove far more difficult than fixing a flat tire. The strangest part about falling in love is that no single moment ever announces it. You only recognize the beginning after it's already become impossible to forget. My truck was repaired before sunset. I should have thanked Griffith, shaken his hand one last time, and continued toward the abandoned prairie towns my editor wanted photographed. Instead, I heard myself asking a question I hadn't planned. Mind if I come back tomorrow? Griffith looked genuinely surprised. For pictures? Partly. He folded his arms against the fence beside the barn. And the other part? I smiled. I haven't finished photographing this place. His blue eyes narrowed with quiet amusement. You mean the ranch? I mean everything. He considered the answer for a moment before nodding once. We start feeding the horses at 6. I'll be here. The following morning, I arrived 5 minutes early. The sunrise spread across the Oklahoma sky in shades of orange and pale pink, covering the red earth with warm light that no camera could fully capture. Griffith was already working. Of course he was. He leaned against the corral fastening a leather saddle while one of the horses nudged his shoulder impatiently. You beat the sun, I said. It loses every morning. I laughed. I walked right into that one. His smile appeared again. Small, quiet, increasingly familiar. The days that followed settled into an effortless rhythm. I extended my assignment twice, inventing excuses about weather conditions and lighting whenever my editor called. The truth was embarrassingly simple. I wanted another day at Hayes Ranch. Then another. Soon I found myself helping with chores before ever lifting my camera. I repaired fence posts, filled water troughs, stacked hay bales badly enough that Griffith eventually stopped pretending I was actually helping. You've definitely never worked on a ranch. What gave it away? You wore new boots. I looked down. They're practical. They're clean. He didn't even try to hide the grin that followed. By the end of the week, they weren't clean anymore. Neither were my jeans. Neither was I. Oddly enough, I had never felt more comfortable. Some evenings, after the work was finished, we climbed onto the old wooden fence overlooking the western pasture. Neither of us hurried to fill the silence. The wind usually did that for us. One evening, I finally asked the question that had been lingering in my mind. Have you ever wanted to leave? Griffith watched the horses grazing below. When I was younger. What changed? I realized I wasn't staying because I was afraid. He looked toward the endless fields stretching beyond the ranch. I stayed because this feels like where I'm supposed to be. And you've never regretted it? Sometimes. His honesty surprised me. I wonder what life somewhere else would look like. He smiled faintly. But wondering isn't the same as wishing. That sentence stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Because I understood exactly what he meant. I had spent years chasing places while Griffith had spent years building one. Neither approach was wrong. They were simply different. One afternoon, Eleanor found me sitting on the porch steps reviewing photographs. She lowered herself into the rocking chair beside me. You look happier. I do. You laugh more. I smiled without looking up. I guess I like it here. She studied me for a quiet moment. People usually think love begins with fireworks. I glanced toward her. It doesn't. She chuckled softly. No. Then how does it begin? She looked toward the pasture where Griffith was repairing another section of fencing. It begins when someone starts feeling like peace. I followed her gaze. Griffith removed his work gloves, pushed windblown hair away from his forehead, and paused to watch a young colt wandering too far from its mother. There was nothing dramatic about the scene. Nothing cinematic. Just an ordinary man doing ordinary things beneath an ordinary Oklahoma sky. Yet I couldn't stop watching him. And for reasons I still couldn't explain, the thought of leaving red dirt suddenly felt heavier than every mile I had traveled before. That evening, while the last light disappeared behind the rolling hills, Griffith sat beside me on the porch without saying a word. Our shoulders almost touched. Neither of us moved away. Somewhere in the fading silence between daylight and darkness, two completely different lives began quietly making room for each other. Love doesn't usually disappear because two people stop caring. More often, it begins to hurt because life asks them to choose between two dreams they never expected to compete. By the end of September, Hayes Ranch no longer felt like a place I was visiting. It felt like the place where my days naturally belonged. Every morning started before sunrise. Griffith would already be outside, coffee in one hand and a feed bucket in the other. I eventually stopped setting an alarm because the sound of horses moving through the pasture had become enough to wake me. You city people finally adapting? Griffith teased one morning. I'll have you know I haven't complained about getting up early in almost a week. He looked thoughtfully toward Eleanor, who was watering flowers on the porch. I think that's a personal record. I laughed. I liked you better when you were quiet. I am quiet. You're quietly sarcastic. For the first time since we'd met, he laughed out loud. It caught both of us by surprise. The sound wasn't loud or dramatic. It was warm, honest. The kind of laughter that escaped only when someone forgot to protect themselves. I realized then that Griffith wasn't reserved because he lacked joy. He was reserved because he treated joy like something precious. Something not to waste. The days continued slipping by almost unnoticed. Sometimes I photographed the ranch. Sometimes I barely touched my camera at all. Instead, I learned how to mend fences without leaving crooked posts, how to recognize approaching storms by watching the clouds, and how to earn the trust of nervous horses simply by standing still. Griffith never explained these things with long instructions. He simply demonstrated once, then waited patiently while I figured out the rest. It was strangely comforting. One evening we drove into the nearest small town for supplies. The grocery store closed before sunset. Everyone seemed to know Griffith. People waved, stopped to talk, asked about Eleanor, asked about the cattle, asked whether the autumn calves looked healthy. He answered every question with quiet kindness. Watching him, I understood something I hadn't noticed before. Griffith wasn't simply part of this community. He helped hold it together. On the drive back, I rested my elbow against the truck window. Everyone likes you. He kept his eyes on the road. I've lived here a long time. No. I shook my head. That's not it. He glanced toward me. They trust you. He was silent for several seconds. I try not to give people reasons not to. The simplicity of the answer somehow made it even more meaningful. A few days later, my phone rang while I was photographing an old windmill. It was my editor. Nathan, where exactly are you? Oklahoma. I know that. He sighed. The magazine loved your first batch. That's good. We've got another assignment. I waited. Yellowstone. My heart skipped. It was the kind of opportunity photographers spent years hoping for. 3 months documenting wildlife before winter. National publication. Excellent pay. Career-changing exposure. You'd leave next Friday. I looked across the pasture. Griffith was repairing a gate with his back turned toward me. Think about it tonight. The call ended. For the rest of the afternoon, I couldn't focus through the camera lens. Everything appeared slightly blurred. Not because of the light. Because my mind refused to stay still. That evening, Eleanor noticed before either of us spoke. You've got news. I nodded. Yellowstone. She smiled gently. That's wonderful. It is. But I stared into my untouched coffee. I don't know why it doesn't feel that simple. Griffith quietly set his mug on the table. When do you leave? If I accept. I hesitated. Next Friday. He lowered his eyes for only a moment. That's a great opportunity. His voice was steady, supportive, exactly what a friend should say. Yet something inside me quietly wished he had asked me to stay. He never did. Later that night, I stood alone beneath a sky crowded with stars. The ranch was peaceful. The wind carried the familiar scent of dry grass and distant rain. Behind me, the porch light switched on. Griffith stepped outside without saying anything. He stood beside me, our shoulders nearly touching once again. Neither of us mentioned Yellowstone. Neither of us mentioned goodbye. But for the first time since I had arrived on that dusty Oklahoma road, silence no longer felt comfortable. It felt like something neither of us knew how to cross. The hardest goodbyes are never spoken in anger. They're whispered through all the things two people are too afraid to say. The week disappeared faster than either of us expected. Every sunrise felt borrowed. Every sunset felt like a countdown. Neither Griffith nor I mentioned Yellowstone again, but it quietly settled between us like another chair at the dinner table. Invisible, yet impossible to ignore. I accepted the assignment 3 days before my departure. When I told Eleanor, she hugged me so tightly I almost forgot why my chest hurt. I knew you would, she said. You did. She smiled with the quiet certainty that only comes from living a long life. Some dreams are too important to refuse. I nodded. Then why does it feel like I'm giving something up instead of gaining something? She glanced toward the barn, where Griffith was brushing one of the horses. Because sometimes you are. That answer stayed with me all afternoon. The evening before I was scheduled to leave, Griffith asked if I wanted to ride out to the western pasture. We saddled 2 horses without much conversation. The trail climbed gently over rolling hills painted gold by the setting sun. Neither of us rushed the silence. It had become our most honest language. When we reached the highest ridge overlooking the ranch, Griffith stopped his horse. From there, red dirt stretched endlessly in every direction. The barn looked impossibly small. The fences disappeared into the horizon. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and approaching autumn. It's beautiful, I said quietly. It always has been. We climbed down and let the horses graze nearby. For several minutes, we simply stood beside each other. I used to think I'd leave someday, Griffith admitted. I looked at him. What changed? He bent down, scooping a handful of the red soil into his palm. I realized some roots grow deeper than ambition. He opened his hand, letting the dirt slip through his fingers. I belong here. The words weren't apologetic. They were simply true. I understood them because I felt the opposite. My roots had never stayed anywhere long enough to grow. I don't belong anywhere, I admitted. Griffith looked at me with that calm expression I had come to know so well. I don't think that's true. No, I think you're still looking. His voice was gentle. So don't stop. I laughed softly, though it sounded more fragile than amused. You always know the right thing to say. No. He shook his head. I just try not to say the wrong thing. The sun slipped lower. Golden light settled across the hills. Without thinking, our hands brushed as we stood side by side. Neither of us moved away. The touch lasted only a heartbeat. Maybe 2. Yet it felt longer than entire seasons. I turned toward him. He was already looking at me. There was no uncertainty in his eyes. Only quiet understanding. I wanted to close the distance between us. To tell him that somewhere between repairing fences and photographing horses, I had fallen hopelessly in love with the life we had accidentally built together. Instead, fear won. Fear that I had imagined everything. Fear that speaking would destroy what already existed. So I smiled. He smiled back. Small, gentle, beautiful. It was enough to break my heart. The following morning, the truck was packed before sunrise. My camera rested on the passenger seat. The road that had brought me here now waited to carry me away. Eleanor kissed my cheek. You'll come back. I hope so. No. She corrected me softly. You will. Griffith carried my last equipment case to the truck. Drive carefully. I will. Another silence. Longer this time. Finally, I reached out my hand. He looked at it for a second before taking it. His grip was warm, steady, reluctant. Thank you, I said. For fixing my tire? For changing my life. Something flickered across his face. A feeling so brief I almost missed it. If this road ever brings you back, he said quietly, you'll always have a place here. I wanted to answer. Instead, I climbed into the truck because I knew that if I waited 1 second longer, I might never leave at all. As the ranch disappeared in my rearview mirror, I realized something that every photograph I had ever taken had failed to teach me. Some places become unforgettable not because of what you see there, but because of who is waiting when you arrive. Distance has a peculiar way of measuring love. It doesn't ask how many miles separate two people. It asks how long they can carry each other in silence. Yellowstone was everything my editor had promised. Snow-covered mountains, endless forests, golden eagles circling above frozen cliffs, wolves moving through fresh powder before sunrise. Every photograph felt worthy of a magazine cover. Every assignment pushed me closer to the career I had dreamed about since college. People congratulated me almost every day. You've made it. I smiled every time I heard those words. But success has an odd habit of becoming strangely quiet when there's no one waiting to celebrate it with you. The cabin provided by the magazine overlooked a valley that photographers traveled across the world to see. Every evening I stood on the porch watching the last light disappear behind the mountains. And every evening, without meaning to, I imagined a different sunset. One over a red Oklahoma pasture. I still called Eleanor every Sunday. She insisted on hearing every story. Did you finally photograph one of those wolves? I did. Were they as beautiful as you hoped? More. She laughed warmly. I'll expect a copy. You'll have the first one. Then she always asked the same question. Have you talked to Griffith? The answer was usually the same. Not this week. It wasn't because either of us had decided to stop talking. Life simply became crowded. The ranch entered its busiest season. My assignments stretched from dawn until well after dark. Sometimes I typed long messages only to delete them before pressing send. Sometimes he replied with a photograph of a newborn foal or the first snowfall covering the fields. Sometimes days passed between conversations. Then weeks. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no arguments. No misunderstandings. Only two men moving forward through different lives that seemed to travel in parallel instead of together. One afternoon, I received a small package at the field office. There was no return address. Inside was a weathered horseshoe polished until it almost shined. Folded beneath it was a handwritten note. Thought you might need a little red dirt wherever you're standing. Griffith. I held the note for several minutes. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't elaborate. It was exactly the kind of gift Griffith would choose. Practical. Simple. Honest. The horseshoe remained on my desk for the rest of the assignment. Every morning before leaving with my camera, I touched it without even realizing I had started doing so. Winter slowly surrendered to spring. The Yellowstone project ended. Another assignment followed almost immediately. Then another. Arizona, Colorado, Washington. Months blended into years more quickly than I wanted to admit. Magazine covers became exhibitions. Exhibitions became awards. People recognized my name before introducing themselves. Yet every airport looked the same. Every hotel room felt temporary. One rainy evening in Seattle, after finishing an interview for a photography journal, I opened an old storage box that had traveled with me across the country. Inside were maps, camera lenses, a faded receipt from a roadside diner in Oklahoma, and one photograph I had never shown anyone. Griffith stood beside a wooden fence at sunset, one hand resting on the top rail while the wind pushed his blonde hair across his forehead. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was watching the horses. Completely unaware that I had captured the quiet expression I remembered better than any landscape. I traced the edge of the photograph with my thumb. For the first time in years, I admitted something I had been carefully avoiding. I wasn't homesick. I wasn't lonely because of constant travel. I missed one person, and no amount of success had ever changed that truth. My phone buzzed against the table. It was Eleanor. I answered immediately. Her voice sounded softer than I remembered. Nathan. Hi, Eleanor. I hope I'm not interrupting. Never. She paused for a moment. I think it's time you came home. The words settled heavily between us. Is everything all right? Another silence. Long enough for my heart to begin racing. I'd rather tell you in person. After the call ended, I looked once more at the photograph of Griffith. Outside, rain slid slowly down the hotel window. Inside, I realized the road I had spent years avoiding had quietly begun calling me back. Sometimes home isn't the place you return to. It's the truth you've spent years trying not to face. I booked the earliest flight the next morning. By sunset, the Seattle skyline had disappeared beneath the clouds. By midnight, I was crossing Oklahoma beneath a sky filled with familiar stars. The rental truck rolled onto the old highway just before dawn. Nothing had changed. The same faded gas station still stood at the crossroads. The same weathered grain silos watched over empty fields. Even the red earth seemed untouched by the years. Yet everything inside me felt different. I wasn't returning as the young photographer chasing his first opportunity. I was coming back as a man finally willing to ask himself why success had never felt complete. When Hayes Ranch came into view, my hands tightened around the steering wheel. The wooden sign still leaned slightly to one side. The fences looked newer in places. The old red barn had been repainted, though not enough to erase its age. Some things had changed. Most hadn't. I parked beside the farmhouse just as Eleanor stepped onto the porch. For one terrifying second, I barely recognized her. She had grown noticeably thinner. Her silver hair had become almost completely white. But when she smiled, she was still the same woman who had welcomed a stranded stranger into her kitchen years ago. Nathan. I crossed the yard without thinking and wrapped my arms around her. She laughed softly. I was wondering how long it would take. You should have told me sooner. And had you worrying from 3 states away? She gently patted my shoulder. I preferred seeing your face instead. I stepped back, studying her carefully. Are you sick? Old? Eleanor. She smiled. The doctors have much fancier words. Neither of us needed them. I understood enough. She reached for my hand. Come inside. The kitchen smelled exactly the way I remembered. Fresh bread, coffee, rosemary. The scent alone nearly undid me. You've kept everything the same. She looked around the room. This house knows who it is. I smiled. I miss this place. I know. She poured 2 cups of coffee before sitting across from me. For several moments, we simply enjoyed the quiet. Finally, I asked the question that had followed me across the country. How's Griffith? She looked out the window before answering. He's working. Of course he is. He always is. Another pause. He's taken good care of the ranch. I'm not surprised. He also never married. I looked up. The words arrived so unexpectedly that I almost wondered if I had imagined them. Eleanor watched my reaction with gentle understanding. I thought you should know. I struggled to find an answer. I never asked. No. She stirred her coffee slowly. You were afraid to. The honesty left no room for denial. I suppose I was. She leaned forward slightly. Can I ask you something? Anything. In all these years. Her voice softened. Have you ever truly stopped loving him? The room became impossibly quiet. Outside, wind rustled through the oak trees. Somewhere in the pasture, a horse whinnied softly. I thought about every city I had lived in, every award hanging on my office wall, every sunrise I had photographed, every lonely hotel room. Then I thought about one old horseshoe still sitting on my desk, one faded photograph folded inside my suitcase, one man whose name had quietly followed me through every chapter of my life. No, I admitted. I never did. Eleanor smiled sadly, as though she had known the answer all along. I didn't think so. She stood carefully. Come with me. We walked across the yard toward the western pasture. The same ridge where Griffith and I had watched the sunset years earlier stretched across the horizon. As we reached the fence line, Eleanor stopped walking. He'll be here soon. What do you mean? He repairs this fence every Thursday. I looked at the weathered wooden rails. They don't seem broken. She laughed. They haven't needed fixing in years. Confusion crossed my face. Before I could ask another question, the distant sound of an approaching pickup drifted across the fields. I turned instinctively. A familiar truck appeared through a cloud of red dust. It stopped beside the barn. The driver's door opened. A tall man climbed out wearing worn boots, faded jeans, and a denim work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. His blonde hair had become slightly darker with age, his shoulders broader, his face more weathered beneath the Oklahoma sun. But when he lifted his eyes toward the pasture, I recognized him immediately, and judging by the stunned expression that crossed Griffith's face, he recognized me too. There are moments when an entire lifetime changes without a single word being spoken. Seeing Griffith again was one of them. For several heartbeats, neither of us moved. The wind carried red dust across the pasture just as it had the day we first met. Horses grazed peacefully beyond the fence, completely unaware that two lives, separated for nearly a decade, had suddenly collided again. Griffith took one slow step forward. Nathan. It was the first time I had heard my name in his voice for years. Somehow, it still sounded exactly the same. Hi, Griffith. The greeting felt painfully small compared to everything that stood between us. He stopped a few feet away. You came back. I did. I wasn't sure you ever would. Neither was I. He glanced toward Eleanor, who quietly smiled before walking back toward the farmhouse, leaving us alone without saying a single word. The silence she left behind wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. Griffith rubbed the back of his neck, searching for something to say. You look different. I've got more gray hair. You've earned it. I laughed softly. So have you. His smile appeared, the same restrained smile that had once made ordinary days unforgettable. I've seen your photographs. I blinked. You have. They're everywhere. I didn't know. I bought every magazine that featured your work. The confession caught me completely off guard. You kept up with me? He looked down for a moment. I tried. Those two words carried years of quiet loyalty. I still have the horseshoe, I admitted. His eyes lifted immediately. You do? It sat on every desk I've worked at. He let out a slow breath, almost as if he had been holding it for years. I wasn't sure if you'd even remember where it came from. I remembered every mile of this place. We began walking slowly toward the western pasture without deciding to. Our boots followed the same trail they had walked countless evenings years before. The ranch looked healthier than ever. New fencing stretched across several fields. The barn roof had been replaced. Young horses grazed beside older ones. You've done well, I said. We've worked hard. He smiled toward the farmhouse. Eleanor refuses to retire. That sounds like her. We both laughed. The sound felt strangely familiar, like finding an old melody neither of us had forgotten. When we reached the ridge overlooking the ranch, we stopped. The same hill, the same endless horizon. Only we had changed. I came back too late. The words escaped before I could stop them. Griffith didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the distant pasture where a group of horses wandered through the tall grass. I used to think that. He finally turned toward me. But then I realized something. What? If someone is meant to come home? He shrugged gently. They arrive when they're finally ready. Emotion tightened my throat. I should have called more. You should have. I should have visited. You should have. I should have told you how I felt. This time he looked directly into my eyes. Yes. The single word landed with quiet certainty. I swallowed hard. I was in love with you. There. After all those years. The truth finally existed outside my own heart. The wind moved softly through the grass. Griffith closed his eyes for just a moment before smiling with unmistakable sadness. I know. You knew? Nathan. He laughed under his breath. I've known since the day you asked if you could come back to photograph a ranch you'd already photographed. Despite everything, I smiled. I thought I was hiding it. You weren't. Then why didn't you say anything? His answer came almost immediately. Because you were always looking toward the next horizon. He looked across the open fields. I loved you too much to become the reason you stopped chasing your dream. Tears blurred my vision before I even realized they had formed. You were never the obstacle. No. You were the reason every place after this one felt incomplete. For the first time since we had reunited, Griffith reached for my hand. His grip felt exactly as I remembered. Strong. Warm. Steady. I stopped waiting for you to come back years ago, he admitted quietly. My heart sank. But his fingers tightened gently around mine. I never stopped hoping you would. As the Oklahoma sun began sinking toward the horizon, the years between us seemed to dissolve into the evening light. Neither of us needed another promise. We had already spent enough of our lives apart. This time, we simply stood together, watching the sun settle over the red earth, both understanding that the rest of our story would no longer be written in different places. People often ask me which photograph is my favorite. They expect me to name a glacier in Alaska, a wolf crossing fresh snow in Yellowstone, a lightning storm over the Arizona desert. They never expect the answer I always give. My favorite picture was never published. A year has passed since I came home. Funny how easily that word finally fits. Home. Not because the ranch suddenly became mine. Not because the world outside Oklahoma disappeared. But because I finally understood that love isn't a place that keeps you from becoming yourself. It's the place that allows you to become the person you were always meant to be. Eleanor insists she doesn't need help. Naturally, neither Griffith nor I listen to her. Every morning begins the same way. Coffee before sunrise. Feeding the horses together. Repairing whatever decides to break that day. Sometimes I still travel for photography assignments. Just not for months at a time anymore. I've learned that meaningful work doesn't require leaving every piece of your heart behind. Sometimes Griffith comes with me on shorter trips. He still claims he doesn't understand cameras. Yet somehow, he always notices the moments worth photographing before I do. "You're missing something," he'll say. "What?" "The light." I adjust my position. "Take another frame." He's almost always right. One afternoon, while organizing old negatives inside the farmhouse, I discovered the very first photograph I had taken at Hayes Ranch. The windmill. Golden grass. Late afternoon sunlight. At first glance, it looked exactly as I remembered. Then I noticed something I had completely overlooked all those years ago. Standing near the fence in the distance, almost too small to recognize, was Griffith. He wasn't posing. He wasn't looking toward the camera. He was simply watching the horses, completely unaware that he had quietly entered the first chapter of our story before either of us understood what it would become. I carried the photograph outside. Griffith was repairing a saddle beneath the shade of the oak tree. "Look at this." He studied the faded print. "You kept that. I didn't even know you were in it." A slow smile crossed his face. "I guess I was always there." "You were." I looked at him. I just needed years to understand what I was actually looking at. He reached for my hand without hesitation. There was nothing secret about us anymore. Nothing hidden. The neighbors knew. The town knew. The people who mattered had long ago stopped caring about explanations. They simply cared that we were happy. That evening, Eleanor joined us on the porch. The 3 rocking chairs creaked gently as the sun settled over the red fields. "This," she said quietly, "is exactly how I hoped this porch would look someday." Griffith smiled. "You planned all of this, didn't you?" She looked entirely innocent. "I have no idea what you're talking about." I laughed. "You had us meet at that fence on purpose. I merely suggested where someone might be working." Griffith shook his head. "You never repaired that fence." "I repaired it every Thursday." "It wasn't broken." She sipped her tea. "It helped eventually." We all laughed together. The sound drifted across the pasture with the evening breeze. As darkness slowly covered the ranch, Griffith rested his head lightly against mine. No dramatic speeches. No promises carved into stone. We had already learned that life rarely follows perfect plans. Instead, it offers ordinary mornings, shared laughter, steady hands, second chances, and if you're fortunate enough to recognize them, a love patient enough to wait until you're finally ready to come home. Sometimes visitors stop by the ranch and ask why the soil here is so remarkably red. Griffith usually explains the geology. I simply smile, because I know another answer. The earth isn't what gives this place its color. It's every memory buried beneath it. Every goodbye, every return, every quiet moment that taught 2 stubborn men that love doesn't ask where you've been. It only asks whether, when the road finally leads you back, you're brave enough to stay. And this time, I was.